Richard Haass has a very busy Monday morning because he is at the center of a raging debate of the past in Afghanistan. He's at the Council on Foreign Relations. I can't say enough about their website this morning to give you depth. And also my book of the summer, a number of summers ago, The World, A Brief Introduction. I would suggest, Ambassador Haass, it needs an update. Richard Haass, I want to get right to it, and I want to get to the movement forward as I'll speak to Thomas Barfield coming up. Is this Taliban the same as the Taliban of 2002?
If anything, it's worse, Tom, because now it's had the chance to regroup. It now has access to American arms, and it's proven its resilience. And the opposition in Afghanistan is, if anything, weaker than it was. So it's at least as bad. There's no sign, what you might say, of any mellowing by the Taliban.
A careful read of Richard Haass, The World is a vacuum gets filled. It's Physics 101, Ambassador Haass. I know you took 3 courses in physics in Oberlin a few years ago. Is the vacuum going to be filled by China with the 47-mile border they have constructed by the British in 1895?
No, the Chinese don't want to get into Afghanistan. What they want, Tom, is to keep essentially Afghanistan out of China. They are worried about their own Muslim minorities. The last thing they want is for them to be radicalized. Indeed, none of the neighbors, with the exception of Pakistan, I think, has a lot of appetite for getting into Afghanistan. They want to keep its terrorists. They want to keep its guns. They want to keep its drugs out of their country. Also, one other thing, they're worried about refugee flows. And that's the other thing that people are going to be focused on.
Let's swing 500 miles west to Iran and the wonderful frontline effort that was done a number of weeks ago. There. It is Sunni and it is Shia. Is that ultimately what this will be about?
No, again, I don't see particular friction there between Iran and Afghanistan. We've got problems with Iran, but that's to do with everything they're doing in the region, their nuclear program. This is look, Iran has been helpful in the past. 20 years ago, Tom, the Iranians were actually helpful in standing up a post-Taliban government in Afghanistan. Why? They want a stable neighbor. They don't want one that's producing and exporting drugs. So I don't think Iran is the place to look, either for the problem here or for the solution.
So, Richard, where do we look? Do we look to the allies who feel somewhat betrayed by the U.S.?
No, the answer is there is no solution to look for. This is now the new reality in Afghanistan. It's going to be awful for Afghans. The danger is they invite terrorists back in, or terrorists invite themselves back in. Obviously, America's reputation for consistency and reliability has taken a hit. I worry about the long-term consequences for Pakistan. It's ironic. Pakistan provided a sanctuary which kept the Taliban alive, helped bring us to this point. It's quite possible some in the Taliban may now want to go ahead and further radicalize Pakistan. So in the medium to long run, I would worry about that. But I think for the United States, the focus has got to be on getting as many Afghans who work with us out of that country. It's outrageous that we would leave them behind, that we would abandon them. And then I think we have to go around the world trying to demonstrate that the awful scenes that we're seeing in Afghanistan are not somehow representative of the totality of American foreign policy. We've got to persuade people that they should not read too much into this.
Richard, a lot of officials have said this is not a war we could win. We basically were keeping the peace and sacrificing American soldiers and, frankly, soldiers of the allies to keep a peace that was unnatural in this nation. What do you say to counter that? Why it was important, in your view, for U.S. troops to remain in Afghanistan at a much lower rate than they had been, say, 5-10 years ago?
Look, we had reduced the U.S. military presence to around 3,000. There hasn't been an American combat death for 18 months. So this was a situation, I thought, that for a relatively modest investment, we were getting good results. The American presence was essential to keep the 9,000 allied troops there, and it provided a psychological and military floor for the Afghans. So no, it wasn't going to give you peace. It wasn't going to give you a military victory. What it was going to do is avoid bringing about exactly what we're seeing on our screens. And I think sometimes in foreign policy, you've got to measure success not by what you accomplish, but by what you avert. And by that definition, this was a success, and we undermined our own policy.
Richard Haass, with all of your experience, this comes back to, and it's of our childhood, Scoop Jackson of Washington State, and maybe on to the late Donald Rumsfeld and others. It's this thing called neoconservatism. How did the neoconservative crew pick up the pieces in your Washington?
Well, I'm not sure neoconservatives matter a whole lot right now because they have an ambitious foreign policy. They want to transform the world. They often want the United States to act alone. I would think, Tom, the biggest challenge for the United States right now, and by the way, it crosses party lines, just like Afghanistan policy was something that crossed party lines, is that we do too little. That the United States essentially pulls back from the world, focuses on our challenges here at home, and essentially underreaches in the world. And if I had a crystal ball, I would be more worried about American underreach going forward than overreach.
Well, I mean, to go to Zakaria's post-American world, what does our post-Afghanistan world look like?
Well, in Afghanistan, it looks horrific. Around the rest of the world, that's still for us to determine. Are we going to stand by our allies? Are we going to stand up to Russia and China? Are we going to actually do more to combat climate change, to improve global health machinery? There's nothing about Afghanistan, Tom, that stops us from increasing our exports of COVID vaccines. There's nothing about Afghanistan, Tom, that stops us from joining the Asia-Pacific regional trade agreements. I can go on. So again, I disagree fundamentally with what the last administration and this one have done in Afghanistan, but that doesn't stop us from doing other smart things in the world.
Richard, just to sort of put a bow on this, you were talking about this concern about allies and the perception of the United States and the trustworthiness of some of the assertions and involvement that the U.S. has had. You're concerned about under-involvement. With some of these other initiatives that you're talking about, whether it's combating global warming, whether it's combating the pandemic, how much clout has President Biden lost on the international stage among allies who already are somewhat skeptical of the U.S. promises?
Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This is a bad thing. He gained some clout by the original response to COVID, increasing vaccine production and distribution. He gained clout by the performance of the U.S. economy. This is clearly a setback. That said, he's got 3.5 years to go to make a record, but there's no way this is anything but something significant in the deficit column. This will hurt both the reality and the perception of the United States in the world, and it reinforces a narrative that was already out there, which is that this United States is different than the old United States that had tremendous staying power throughout the Cold War.
Richard, tremendous piece in Project Syndicate over the weekend. Thank you for writing that. Before we let you go, a message for this administration. We've heard a limited amount from the president over the weekend. What's your number one question for them this morning?
What more can they do to help these Afghans who are trapped in the country and are vulnerable? I just find that I find it painful to watch. So I think we've got to do more to help them. We can't simply be focused on getting Americans out. And then the real question is what we've been talking about here. How does this administration prove to the world that American foreign policy should not be understood through this lens or prism? We have got to be active and we've got to be smart elsewhere. We can't undo the mistakes we've made in Afghanistan. Let's be blunt. Doesn't mean, though, we have to make mistakes elsewhere.